In the updated report of 2021 budget implementation for the period of January to May, federal government retained revenue was 1.84 trillion naira. On the expenditure side, 4.86 trillion naira has been spent. Let's bring in Ayodeji Ebo, now head retail investment at Chapel Hill, Durham, to weigh into this. Good morning, Mr. Ebo. Thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
So the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning published the budget implementation report as of May 2021. What's your take on this updated report?
Okay, thanks. I think firstly, it's commendable for us to have like an update on a report because it helps us to assess the current position of the government and also to see what we should expect for the rest of the year. So looking at the report, you first looking at the item on the gross revenue, which is what is shared across the federal, states, and the local governments. You see, for government was able to achieve about 79%, able to raise just about 3.4 trillion naira relative to the expectation of about 4 trillion naira. And now coming down, looking at the federal government level, you would also know the government was able to achieve about 55% of that, which government was able to realize, or what got to the federal government was about 1.8 trillion rather, out of the expected about 3.3 trillion. And the main reason for this was the oil and contribution of the oil and gas sector to total revenue was around 50%, compared to the non-oil did very well, was around 98% in terms of the revenue. And the major item that impacted on the oil revenue was subsidy payment. Yes, it was not provided for in the budget, but we all know the government had to, oil prices have moved up significantly, and government is still taking that or bearing that burden of subsidy. So that impacted, and total deduction from federation within the first 5 months was around 428 billion naira, which includes the 13% derivation. So now looking at the cost level, you would also discover that that is also very high, but by and large, I think we saw that there's a bit of lag in terms of the revenue collection by the government.
All right, on the revenue side, looking at the revenue mix performance, would you say there's, any improvement in oil revenue performance as a result of the high oil prices?
Okay, thanks. Very interesting question. Yes, oil prices are above $70 per barrel, and when you look at the budget, the estimate was around $40 per barrel that was used for the budget. But we're also aware of the OPEC cuts that also capped what we can produce. So that's limited the oil revenue. So in terms of gross, yes, was still very impressive, was close to about 60% in terms of contribution. But when you now take out the net, because of the subsidy that we have to, the government have to pay, that reduced significantly what goes into the federation account that is distributed. Even earlier this year, the NNPC Director General also highlighted that the under recovery, which is used to pay for subsidy, would impact on what will be available for the FAC allocation.
Now, non-oil revenue seems to show high momentum. Do you think this is sustainable for the rest of the year?
Yes, I think it is sustainable, given the reduction in terms of the spread of COVID-19, as well as the improvement in vaccination. We've also seen that economies also open up, our businesses open up rather, and that would help sustain. So when you look at the non-oil revenue, we saw that impressive performance around the taxes. We saw the the VAT, value added tax, also increased. I think we're able to achieve about 207% performance within that space. Even custom duty, despite the trade challenges, they were also able to achieve close to about 80% of the target within that period. So for non-oil, it's possible for that performance to be sustained, but we're also looking at more deliberate policies to drive productivity in the economy so that the tax can be boosted. In terms of collection, there needs to be a lot that also has to be done, because when you look at based on what the ability to collect or to generate relative to what actually dovetail to what is distributed, you still see that there's still a lot of gap. So it's possible for us to achieve very significant, very impressive record at the end of the year for non-oil sector revenue.
All right, let's look at the expenditure side. 4.86 trillion naira spent so far. Any call for concerns here?
I think there's a major call for concern. So when you look at the revenue base, yes, in terms of implementation, I think it's about 89%. But when you look at it vis-a-vis the actual revenue, so looking at the line item, so you look at debt servicing, is about 1.8 trillion. I know that increased as a result of about 400 billion ways and means, interest on ways and means. That's the CBN borrowing to the government. They were able to pay out 428 billion naira within that space. That, when you look at actual revenue that was accrued to the government, was also around 1.8 trillion. So it means that about 98%, based on the calculation, about 98% of the revenue was used to service debt. You can see that it's very unsustainable. When you also look at personnel costs, it's almost about I think about 60 or 70% of net real actual revenue. So yes, it's good to project, but when you look at it based on the actual revenue, you will discover that there's really call for concern. And looking at when you look at the cost, capital expenditure, based on projection, projection is that capital expenditure will be about 30% of total expenditure. But at the end of the day, government has just disbursed or released about, I would say, spent about 978 billion naira on capital expenditure relative to 1.7 billion naira budgeted. And that is about 20% of total expenditure. So you will discover that the capital expenditure that has the most multiplier effect on the economy is the one that suffers the most. This is the one that benefits most Nigeria, because it has to do with infrastructure, making easing business. So there needs to be a deliberate effort to see how we can increase the allocation and sustain, and for us to be able to open up the economy and also ease doing business in Nigeria. So when you look at the spending, right, you will see that we spend more to non-productive sector. So with 98% going into debt servicing, it means that almost, if we assume that what we have realized is being used, we deduct debt servicing cost, it means all other expenses in terms of paying salaries, we have been borrowing to do that, and also other non-debt recurrent expenditure.
As capital expenditure has continued to receive the least attention, what can we do to salvage this situation?
Okay, I think what it may give a bit of comfort is by the time we see the implementation of the new company called IFRACO, that's Infrastructure Corporation Company of Nigeria, which is said to be about 15 trillion. So that may help maybe bridge the gap in terms of our infrastructure. But we need to, government needs to see how you need to cut, first of all, governance, because most times if you want to view the government like a business, if you are not earning as much revenue and you are unable to increase your ability to earn the revenue, then you need to reduce the cost of doing the business. So I would say the cost of doing the business is governance. So for us to be able to have much of what Nigerians can benefit more from, which is the capital expenditure, then there needs to be a reduction in that element. Yes, borrowing, I would say that we shouldn't borrow, but most of the borrowings, it should be deliberate. We should move them more to productive sectors so that we're able to generate cash flow that will be able to pay in the future.
So based on budget performance, what's your expectation for the rest of the year? And is this trend sustainable? And how much of, growth impact should we expect?
Okay, thanks. In light of the continued rise in crude oil prices, that will continue to increase the amount of oil subsidy that government will have to be paying, which will reduce the available resources. What we are reviewing now is just between January and May. And when you look at oil prices have increased by maybe another 10% between that time and now, it means that the amount of subsidy payment would also increase. Based on our estimate, we are projecting about 1.6 trillion if subsidy is not either gradually removed or removed. It means that a lot of those resources will not be available. And it means borrowing. When you look at the budget deficit, which is currently about 3 trillion based on the first 5 months, it means that there's still going to be a tendency that deficit will increase significantly. So it's really not looking pretty very, very good. We need to ramp up the non-oil sector in terms of non-oil sector revenue in terms of collection, so that we are able to bridge and reduce the gap. If not, based on the projected budget deficit, would surpass that.
All right, thank you very much for your time with us this morning, Ayodeji. Thank you, we do appreciate it.
Always my pleasure.